Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney of Extreme Metal Podcasts. I am the Death Metal Guy, aka, of course I'm taking the door for myself, I paid for the patches.
And I am the Black Metal Guy, aka, up at 4:30 a.m., frantically Googling young Dana Duffy nude stable diffusion futa.
Oh man, Dana Duffy, one, I wonder where she is. Two, have you ever actually listened to Demonic Christ?
Just enough to have a vague idea of what it was. I've probably listened to the record that came out around later aughts, and just enough to get an idea of what it sounded like. I don't know. It was like really burly American Black Death, right?
I want to say that I might have heard it at one point and I just found it kind of boring, but yeah. I don't really remember it that well. Wasn't she also in, she wasn't in Dracada or something, and she was in something else that was...
She was in a band called Mythic, which was Death Doom, which that could be interesting, yeah. I don't know. I think my guess is that the really early Dana Duffy stuff is probably worth checking out.
I think I want to say I've heard Mythic and that was pretty cool. But I don't know. Demonic Christ was kind of a name for a while, probably in the older days when Dana as a woman was like a rarity. But that's another band that was a standard talking point for metalheads that's just completely disappeared now.
There was a bunch of talk about Demonic Christ in the aughts or early tens. But I think because journalists decided she was the wrong kind of woman in metal. It looks like there hasn't been a full length since Punishment for Ignorance in '95, and I'm sure that's not what I heard. Right,
I do really like that if you go to her artist page, she was apparently married to a guy in Anti-Scene for a while.
Oh, wild. That makes a lot of sense, though.
I don't know anything about Anti-Scene. It just strikes me as funny inherently. Mm-hmm. So, anyway.
Well, they were G.G. Allen's backing band for a minute.
Oh, they were?
Yeah.
Okay. That
right
makes
band.
Sense.
Yeah, and they're sort of redneck, aggressively redneck garage punk. They have a song. They've got a sick song called, what was it, Spare Change. Ain't giving you none of my spare change.
Well, many years from now, when I decide to fully explore punk, I look forward to that. Mm-hmm. All right, we've got an episode up front, though, guys. The usual housekeeping. Follow me, the Death Metal Guy, on Facebook at Terminus Podcast. Follow the Black Metal Guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. And if you're particularly invested, feel free to sign up with us on Patreon, because we are perpetually demonetized. I have several more Lamborghinis for you to pay for. $3 and up gets you access to Terminus Prime bonus episodes. $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server, where we were talking about yet again the Azrar BBH drama that continues to depress me every single day.
This is a little one Gash, and you're listening to Terminus.
Okay, and we are back with the record you've all been bothering us about in the comments, chomping at the bit, waiting for us to review. It is the return of Arghoslent after about 15 years with Resuscitation of the Revanchists, a record that was rumored for a long time but is now finally here. So, Death Metal Guy, what do you make of it?
Resuscitation of the Revanchists? Well, Arghoslent should have signed a DNR before they came back. Because this record fucking sucks.
Wait, what's a DNR?
A do not resuscitate order when you, Like if you're put on life, you don't want to be put on life support. If you're in like a coma, you just want them to leave you to die. You sign a DNR.
Yeah. So on that note, honestly, like, yeah, it's an odd title, right? Resuscitation of the Revanchists. Revanchists being, one who seeks revenge, right? But a movement that sort of started in the French reaction to the Franco-Prussian War. But anyway, Resuscitation of the Revanchists it's not exactly that's like a guy who needs to be defibrillated. It's get some chest compressions. It's not exactly a howling rebirth from the shattered cenotaph. And that tone is consistent with some of the song titles here, right? Track 1, Recalcitrant Commando. Well, a recalcitrant commando is one who doesn't want to go on the mission and is in fact actively dragging his heels.
And that's what the band sounds like they're doing here.
Yes, I assumed the titles were sort of ironic, like, haha, it's been a long time, everyone bugged us about making this record, but here we are, right? I assumed the titles were like a joke in that sense, but the joke's on us.
Ah, man.
Right, the titles are very, very literal. You've got a good theory for how this record came into existence.
So So this is a very bad record, but it's very bad in a way that I did not expect it to be, which is that it sounds lazy and tired and phoned in. The band doesn't sound like they want to be there. Like, it sounds extremely recalcitrant. So my theory is that last year, GBK came back from the dead and put out Kohanic Charmers, which is an excellent record. It was one of my favorites of 2022. And most of the lineup on Kohanic Charmers is present here on the new Arghoslent record. These are, just the same lineup, in essence, is on both. Including the drummer from GBK now doing vocals in Arghoslent.
Interesting.
So my theory is that these guys came back from the dead, and what they really wanted to do was a GBK record. They were interested in it, they were passionate about it, and they decided to write and record it, and it was a really good record. But when GBK came back, immediately what happened from the fan base? They all started howling for a new Arghoslent record. I think the fire to do music in the manner of Arghoslent has left these guys, but they were all in the same room together, so they said, fuck it, why not? We can probably make a bunch of money for not a lot of effort. The lack of effort permeates just about everything on this record in precisely the opposite way from how, intensity and cleverness and careful songwriting permeated all of the GBK record. This sounds like a record that was made purely out of circumstance. Arghoslent had been threatening to come back for a lot of years. I do not believe they had any material ready.
So people... You don't think they... I almost wonder if it's the opposite. So do we know that the GBK... I think you talked about this, or I've seen it around somewhere, that the GBK record involved a lot of old riffs that he had sitting around that were reconfigured, obviously, in a really compelling way.
It wouldn't surprise me, because every riff on that GBK record has so much more personality than any of the riffs on this one.
I guess what I'm wondering is if some of this is cutting room floor shit.
Possibly.
These are leftover C riffs.
I mean, maybe, but this really just strikes me as something that was slapped together over the course of a month or something.
Recorded in the studio like a rock band.
Yeah, it's just we're sort of diving into the middle of this, but it's not just that the material sucks. It's that it sounds bored. There's none of the sort of explosiveness and flair of other Arghoslent records. I mean, it goes down to the production, which sucks and is flat and sounds basically unmastered. This seems like something that was just made, it was written and recorded and put out as quickly as possible. Of all the bands to suggest we're committing a cash grab, Arghoslent was not at the top of that list, but somehow they've rocketed up to the #1 position. It's truly bizarre. Of all the bands in the world, you know, your 18th century racist melodeath band is the one that decides to cash grab. Holy shit, man! How does that work?
It's well, it's Let's go to so on a musical level.
Let's
discuss it. So,
well, you should talk about it because I have never been much of an Arghoslent fan. You're more into them than I am, so I think you can talk about kind of like what the difference is, where they came from, what made them distinct to begin with.
Yeah, well, it's never been one of my like go-tos. But something that always impressed me about that, it was just immediately, they are now one of the most influential bands in the underground. Mm-hmm. Like top 3, right? We could probably agree on that. There's tons of young bands are name checking them. They have an indirect influence on how melodies are shaped in music that doesn't sound very much like Arghoslent. And then there are all these Arghoslent clones and Arghoslent-esque projects popping up. The thing that's really striking about them, though, so what everyone fixates on is these elaborate consonant melodies that have sort of shameless hard rockisms in them, right? And big, broad pentatonic scales that sometimes evoke Scotch-Irish redneck violence, and at other times evoke the blues, basically. And also at other times really evoke sort of more elegant folk music or true neoclassical melodies.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's worth mentioning that Arghoslent were, especially in their heyday, like in the 2000s, one of the first bands to really bring heavy metal back into extreme metal. Like now that's a pretty standard technique, but they were very ahead of their time in that during that period.
Although some people attempt to cope with this band by dismissing it as melodeath or poppy or whatever, that is ridiculous. The thing that set it apart at the time, especially when melodeath was still kind of a big thing in the 2000s, was that although it had a lot of Dorian scales in it, it was both more genuinely melodic and far heavier. So people fixate on those melodies, but the way I described them, right, I tried to give a cultural texture to each kind of melody. What the people influenced by them often fixate on is simply a big riff, right? And end up accidentally writing sort of sugary pop music. Arghoslent has never done that, and part of the thing that's kept them from that is, one, the cultural depth in the riffing, right? The sense of history behind it and the different musical languages that are on display, and also the imagination on display, right? This sort of 18th and 19th century world of imperialism just is blasted into the present, right? And on the other hand, it's rhythm. Arghoslent, in many ways, is spiritually a black metal band. It's weird that people call them a death metal band, and they've had more of an impact on modern black metal by far. Mm-hmm. However, they use the whole thing in this sort of epic war metal genre, as we've talked about, is using the full arsenal of death metal to do black metal things. And there's a lot of just Arghoslent excel at doing things you could only do with death metal, especially the heavy rhythmic compression. There is a attention to melodies are closely tied to rhythmic phrases that are sort of complex. They're triplet bass. There's all sorts of triplets. There was swaggering flam patterns. We've talked about that on this show when we hear them in other bands like Cauldron Black Ram or whatever. And there are just extremely heavy chug stuff. And it's not all continuous palm mutes either, right? It's not just like trimmed palm mutes. Everything is crisply articulated. If they're going to play a stream of chugged 16th notes, they will play them. You'll hear them in like quadruple. You'll hear them in fours, right? Everything is marked and articulated. A guy I knew, a guy I knew once talked about, like, described an aristocratic way of speaking as enunciating every consonant, right? You're not going to slur your words in a slovenly way, right? You are going to take the time and make the effort to demarcate everything clearly. And that clarity of form in Arghoslent is granular. It's down to like the articulation of a single triplet. Everything is set off and maximally intended in the way it's played and high impact. And there's just a kind of there's a physical heaviness, there's a rhythmic fluidity and a rhythmic complexity, not in a silly proggy way, but in the way that like a lot of music outside of metal has far more rhythmic complexity.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not talking about like pop music or whatever, but like that there's a lot of breathing room. There is a particular technique which I'll get into a little more about, like transferring momentum across what seem like huge discontinuities in the song. So that's the thing that makes it the thing that makes Arghoslent is not sugary consonant melodies. It's bright, manly, energetic melodies, right? That kind of like Horatio Hornblower, but he's jacked and he's a fucking asshole. And he's drunk again. And at the same time, and the rhythmic energy helps give it that sort of barreling, barrel-chested masculine energy.
Yeah. Although it is worth noting that a lot of what you're saying is correct. Arghoslent is not just about like sugary melodies. That is what a lot of their imitators picked up on, though.
Yeah, I was trying to stress that at the beginning, but yes, that's been one thing we've talked about again and again over the last couple of years, is people have the wrong impression. So this gets us more towards the present record. People have the wrong idea about this band in terms of what's important musically. The one Arghoslent sort of worship project that really gets it is House of Atreus. And they also have the decency not to knock off Arghoslent. However, their music has a huge death thrash-based rhythmic heaviness to it. And these sort of, again, like baffling lateral moves that Arghoslent makes in terms of song structure and rhythm. But what other bands are pulling from this is mostly a reduced sense of the melody. There have been a couple offenders in that regard lately. I didn't really like the Grenadier record. Too sugary for me. There's what was the other one that everyone posted in the Discord lately? It just sounded like Sacramentum.
I don't know about...
it's Usurper, Marauders of the Ascended. It sounded like Sacramentum.
Oh, okay.
But like the problem is that this record sounds like what the nowadays scene thinks Arghoslent sounds like, minus the dazzling quality of the riffs.
I was about to... I get what you're saying, but it's like, for me, it's almost the opposite problem. It's like, if my problem with older Arghoslent is in part that it's sort of an embarrassment of riches, like, you would think the easiest thing for them to do would just be do a bunch of songs with nothing but those big riffs and just collect their cash. But there's, like, none of those big riffs.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, that's the whole... Arghoslent could do a sort of Arghoslent light record, and it'd still be great, because this guy's, like, B and C plus riffs are still better than everyone else's. But, like, this record has, I suppose, there is a baseline of ability that you can still hear on this record. Mm-hmm. But it's like someone took... this is a complaint I had about the last Hate Forest record, although that was played with energy and conviction. Mm-hmm. I felt like each riff was like the concept of a Hate Forest riff, especially on the riffs that were supposed to be more central. It was the concept of a Hate Forest riff, and it didn't bother filling the details in. Arghoslent has this problem all over, almost throughout this record. These are like placeholder Arghoslent riffs.
I think that it should also be addressed that, like, one of the major problems is that, like, all remaining traces of, like, real death metal have been sucked the fuck out of this band.
Yeah, yes.
There's, like, I was in the car earlier today, just to, like, brush up a little bit. I was listening to Hornets of the Pogrom, and that record opens with, like, some blisteringly aggressive, very straightforward death metal riffing. None of that is present here. This is, like, almost nothing but just, like listless, mid-tempo, heavy metal stuff with some bluesy idioms thrown in just to remind you of what band you're listening to.
Yeah, it's, the one word for this record is plotting.
Oh, God, it plods.
And, plodding through the battle ruins. And, it sort of, yeah, it's like, yes, it sounds like lazy or limp new wave of British heavy metal or just hard rock. And, yeah, that's kind of what I meant about, like, the death metal things that they used to... The death metal that was being bent in a black metal direction is absolutely gone, and now they have neither.
Yeah.
Right? They just have sugary almost rhythm guitar based kind of like heavy metal songs. It's God, we were complaining about this the other day. Did you compared it to Visigoth?
Yeah, I would say well, that was sort of in a different context, just because
it doesn't literally sound like Visigoth.
It doesn't literally sound like Visigoth, but, like, the point I was more trying to make is that, like, Arghoslent, when they started, their return to, like, heavy metal and like, burly, sort of the burliest side of NWO BHM and stuff, that was, like, pretty novel. Like, when Incorrigible Bigotry came out, there weren't people still listening to Jagdpanzer. Like, I mean, there were, some fucking weirdos, but they weren't on the internet or anything. Nowadays, bands like Visigoth are packing out pretty big venues. The landscape has changed substantially. So before I heard this record, I was wondering, I saw a lot of people complain about it, and I was wondering if the issue was that, like, now we're just in an era where there's a lot more stuff that sounds like Arghoslent. Yeah. But that's actually not the case. No, this just sucks on its own terms. This is not like an issue of, like, the scene catching up to the band. This is about the band not caring about the product. So, let me get to a sample just to demonstrate this. I want to go to the second track. I mean, this is the second track of a heavy metal record, which is often one of the best. As we regularly say on the show. This is Time Worm Bacterium. So, let's listen to a couple minutes of this. The ball-breaking excitement of this track, and I'll talk about some of my prior issues with this band and how they've managed to cause problems that are just the precise opposite of the ones that I had before. Okay, so absolutely nothing fucking happened in 2 minutes. Nothing happened. Like, that's 40% of the song and nothing happened. Every one of those riffs is like a half riff. On any other album, they would have worked the root notes around in these sort of melodic figures. Here, they don't even bother with that. They just pick a note and they just sort of like jam it out like 8 times in a row. The lead sounds like a parody of Arghoslent. That little lead fragment, which adds absolutely nothing to the song.
The thing at the end, or the lead over it?
That one, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's enough. That's just like, we need to put something over the shitty rhythm guitar part, because otherwise, that's what you have to listen to for a minute.
Yeah,
that last riff makes me. That last riff is so. It's so beneath Galal.
Yeah,
it's why.
Well, let's not all lay it at Galal's feet. This band has, Holocausto also on guitars. And there's been some discussion about who's really kind of the lead writer for Arghoslent. I think I've had some people argue that Arghoslent is more Holocausto and then GBK is more Galal, but I'm not really sure. Either way, it's beneath both of them.
Yes, it's beneath this band. To attempt, like, hopefully listeners understand that riff sucks, but like, that is da 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 da, but with a pause in the middle of it. That's the beginning of a Dorian scale, and it is being played da da in half notes, in like half notes and whole notes, and instead of just playing a full, like, you could play like a, I don't know, you could do some sort of like dense chord if you were just going to be like holding, doing that kind of like rhythm guitar, strummed chords. You could just be playing chords and give them some texture or density. Instead, are they like both playing octaves?
I don't know, because I can't tell, because the production is so fucking muddy and the guitars sound like they're being played through pillows. I can't really tell.
Basically, they're like kind of hollow sounding lead parts. I think they might be both playing octaves, which is, I guess you could certainly create an interesting sound that way, right? Sort of deliberately redundant sound, close harmony. You do cool shit with it, but like, they have used that technique to better effect elsewhere. But here it's just like, why would you do that to play just a chord progression? And
we should also make it clear that this is not like us cherry picking the most boring part of the album. This is what 90% of the record sounds like. Is just sort of listlessly moving from like riff gesture to riff gesture with no there is no more a death knell for a metal record than sounding bored. You can sound shitty, and that's better than sounding bored.
So that riff in particular sounds like it's a wind-up riff, right? It's got kind of, it's a little bit, because of how they're because of the way they're playing it, and it's got kind of a tension to it. Da, 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 da. It's escalating to somewhere, and the way, and it's got that Keating tone to it, right? It needles a bit, and that's a classic Arghoslent. A classic thing they do is wind up riffs that they sustain for a long time, but are inherently satisfying.
Yeah.
The wind up riff is not, you're supposed to be into the wind up riff as well, right? It's not, and in this case, this is a wind up riff that all it does is signal big things coming, and then what happens at the end? Da 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 da. I mean, honestly, that might be the best and most slenty riff on the track yet, but it's not any sort of payoff. It's kind of like, it's like sinking back into the pocket.
Well, I find it really interesting you know, just to pull the camera back a little bit. So I've never been a big fan of Arghoslent because my primary issue with previous records is that there were very cool riffs, but for me, they all sort of vied for attention with each other too much. There was too much of an effort made to make every riff a huge riff. So as a result, the song sort of lacked peaks and valleys and contrast in the way that I wanted to, and the pacing always felt very weird on Arghoslent songs to me. Here, we've got the opposite problem, where none of the riffs are the big riff. So we've sort of arrived at a similar place, except this is way worse than previous ones, because at least there was, like, the immediate value of the riffs to carry me along on previous Arghoslent records.
I almost feel like... So I see what you mean about the structure. I think that's a fair thing that I sort of used to think about them as kind of like a riff salad approach. I would say that, yeah, I would say that even if it were riff salad, the riffs themselves are so sick that I wouldn't turn my nose up at that.
Mm-hmm. No, I get that, like, yeah.
Damn, this is a good salad. However, I do think there was a method to the madness in terms of the song structures. Maybe it didn't always work, but here's a sample that this record really lends itself to side-by-side comparison with their older stuff. So that's what I'm going to do. And Timeworm Bacterium, that particular really annoying riff that is supposed to work like a wind-up, is, I think, kind of evoking the second track from Incorrigible Bigotry. Which is The Purging Fires of War. So let's listen to the wind-up there and how they manage that sort of structural discontinuity. So, basically there, you've got this sort of, this simple, repeated tension-raising riff, right? It's this sort of, this arpeggio, what is it? It's like, tapping, whatever. It's a tapped arpeggio.
Yeah, it's just, it's a little hammer thing, I think.
Yeah, hammer on. Okay, so it's got this simple looping arpeggio, and the first difference between that and the simple figure in Timeworm Bacterium is that it is intrinsically sick. It is a primordial heavy metal gesture. It could just be like fucking, you could hear that on a Maiden record. You could hear that on a, it could be like fucking Yngwie Malmsteen or like Randy Rhoads or something. Mm-hmm. You could, or you could hear a, second wave black metal guy sticking his tongue out and picking that, right?
Well, yeah, it's like the little sweep stuff that Infernus does on the title, the self-titled track on Anagress.
Yeah, for sure. It's a classic just like stick your tongue out and be evil riff. And as that goes for a while, they start to bring in stuff in the rhythm guitar. But the rhythm guitar is not just playing root notes or a supporting role. The melodic shape comes in from the chords under the arpeggio, right? They're using these stacked, this like a sort of mountainous descending slope of chords that sort of reshape where you think the melody is going, right? The melody wants to rise, and then the chords start descending under it, but in a way that make it even heavier and allow them to continue the musical idea without wearing it out. And then it fades out, right? It does something really weird. It doesn't instantly pay off, but there's this huge, you still feel this enormous surge of momentum in your chest. Where's it supposed to go? Halftime triplet flam, crushing, almost like, like epic doom riff comes in with the vocals. The vocals and riff are bespoke engineered for each other. And the riff has that quality of it has that unique rhythmic shape. The chords crash in, and then it sort of turns around in this vicious chug part where they are going out of their way to chug all those notes. And there's a way that the momentum, I think, transfers across the gap, and you end up it's sort of like a juke in sports or something. You just end up kind of there's a dance-like pivot that happens, or a change in stance as a fighter would, and the thing that results is not at all the payoff you expected, but it's crushing, in part because the riff almost forces you to slow down in a way that you're not expecting. It sounds kind of random or stitched together, but I think it's not, and I think it's a really strong transition. Yeah,
I mean, even beyond just like the nature of the melody itself, like I'm not a huge fan of that part, just because I think that Arghoslent had a tendency to like overcommit to some of those ideas, and that's pretty stretched out for me. But even that being said, there's fucking direction to it. There's an idea occurring, they're attempting to accomplish something with that big passage. Like, it indicates purpose, and Time Worn Bacterium doesn't.
Yes, the problem is that, what were originally sort of, let's say, adventurous, spontaneous, and maybe a little bit devil may care song structures, right? Like, hey, let's slam these two riffs together and see if we can get away with it, right? And you find some musical way to make it work. Have become on this record, the degenerate version of that is just slap some stuff together.
Oh, no, yes. The relationship between riffs on this album feels entirely arbitrary. It just.
The arpeggio produces the triplet, the sort of the massive triplet chorus. It just is not, it doesn't produce what you expect it to produce. No riff on this record, almost throughout it, the riffs are sort of self-contained things that sit next to each other, and you could change them around and not a whole lot would change. You could change the order around.
Oh yeah, no, these songs do not have the narrative quality of prior Arghoslent material. So let me do another sample. This is the one part of the record that I like. Pretty much the only thing that actually grabbed me out of it. And what's fascinating is that the fact that this is the part that grabbed me indicates so many of the problems with the album as a whole. This is the opening of Hyenas of the Arunchi. Okay, so I like this. I like both of those riffs. You know, why would you have more than one riff a minute on a record? You know, fuck me. But they're both pretty cool riffs. You know, the first one is this sort of like odd bluesy figure with some unusual sort of like Arghoslent GBK style chording, and the second riff I think is just a genuinely very good riff. I love that little stop in the middle followed by that little Thin Lizzy run. This whole opening of this track strikes me as kind of like an early slow Maiden track. You know, off of something like Number of the Beast. I'm thinking of one song in particular, but it's slipping my mind. Anyway, it's really cool. The problem is, when this is the only part of the album that I give a shit about, it indicates that, they should have just done a rock album. You know, they should have not even made these passing gestures towards still being a death metal band. And related to something you'll play in a little bit, both of those sound like they could just be like on GBK songs. They don't sound like Arghoslent riffs. One of my working theories at this point is that I can't speak to Holocausto, but it seems like Gilal is more interested in rock guitar than extreme metal at this point, which is totally fair. And in GBK, that can sort of survive the translation process, because especially on like Kosherat, my favorite record by them, they're playing around with a lot of those rock ideas. It was always prominent in GBK, but it's especially prominent on Kosherat and also prominent on Kohanic Charmers from last year. That's fine. GBK can survive that transition into this sort of like off-kilter black and roll band. The same can't be said for Arghoslent. When you convert Arghoslent to a rock band, you have lost all the exciting things about Arghoslent, and the fact that this is a cool rock passage is just a further indictment of where the band is at this point, that this is the coolest thing they can pull off.
Well, I think one reason this passage sticks is that it's very rockish, yes, but also it sort of has a downcast majesty to it that you would get on, like, say, like the first Solstice record or something.
Yeah.
It has a brooding British doom thing. And I guess I hadn't thought about that too much in relationship to Arghoslent, but that's probably an important connection. Stuff like Solstice. And it, I guess I was thinking on it with the last sample too, but you can play if they want to do sort of this indulgent, rockish riffing, you do it like this, right? An important part of Arghoslent is tempo exaggeration. Say, they'll go from something very fast to something much slower than you're expecting, or they'll speed something up in a way that's almost uncomfortable to the ear compared to what you're used to for a riff like that. And in this case, they're taking what are in some sense just sprawling, sad rock riffs, and they are messing with the tempo in that way, manipulating the tempo in a way that makes it really heavy. If the record did things like that, operating at tempos like that, it could be really cool, and they have a chance to let the riffs breathe and create an atmosphere that's related to their old records but different, right? It'd be like the Arghoslent version of Hate Forest Battlefields.
Yeah.
Instead, what we have is Arghoslent's jangle rock record.
Yeah.
You know, like the sort of just like sort of mid-tempo shuffle kind of things, like on your first sample. And that is, that kind of tempo works for GBK, but not here. And also because GBK always, like, you can play that tempo but make it sound fast. Right?
It would become, they could do their, cool, evil cruising music stuff.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. The sunglasses. So I've got another sample like that. And I've got another side-by-side comparison, but this is the only part that really grabs me. And this is a part where they tap into for one of the only parts on the record where they tap into the thing that I think is really important, which is that death-thrashing rhythmic convulsion, and the importance of chug. And here's a place also where they play with tempo by pushing something faster than your ear expects or almost even wants. And yet, this also speaks to problems with the record as a whole, especially once we get into the comparison. So let's go into Himek Shabbat. We're going to start about 2:40. So that turnaround is heavy. Yeah, you light into the blasting, you get the and then you start to get this escalating trem riff, which we'll come back to. So what's cool about this? The first riff has the sort of cultural depth to it that you would expect with an Arghoslent riff. It has the sort of contemptuous articulation, right? None of that needs to be palm tremmed in the way it is. The whole thing is clearly demarcated into groups of fours, basically, and it's and there's that kind of there's extreme precision in the way it's delivered, and it has an elaborate and organic shape that you are not likely to come up with if you're locked into the way most extreme metal bands imagine melody, right? Problem, it's a GBK riff, right?
Yeah.
The cultural background to that is Hava Nagila.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the song title sounds like a fucking GBK song.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think this is GBK cutting floor stuff.
I could see that.
It's not to say they're not allowed to cross over between themes, right? They have the record Hornets of the Pogrom, but this really feels like a GBK. At least it was seeded from a GBK riff.
Yes.
And that's a thing that people often maybe don't get. Did we talk about this a bit with the GBK review? I think people don't. One thing they don't understand about these bands is that for GBK, he probably listens to klezmer.
Yeah.
There's a intricate understanding of how that music works and what it has to do with where it converges with Slayer.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Like,
you can even simplify it, and it's just like GBK is fundamentally oriented around like pentatonic and Phrygian melodies, and Arghoslent is rooted in pentatonic and Dorian melodies.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah. And Arghoslent, in the pentatonic, it's either Scotch-Irish folk or it's, Black American folk music, blues, which Arghoslent, they're not dummies. They know that, right? So they have seriously immersed themselves in these traditions. It's an interesting part of the music. It puts some more complexity into the concept than I think a lot of people realize. So it's a GBK riff, and it's good for the reasons GBK riffs are good. It's heavily muted in the way an Arghoslent riff is, but you can tell it's a leftover. They also repeat it a lot. I'm not necessarily going to hold that against them, because I think that Arghoslent has a particular way of being heavy by arbitrarily repeating. However, that riff really wants to turn around after 2 repetitions.
Yeah, and repeating that A-B sequence is not the move. That B riff is leading elsewhere. It's not leading back into the A riff.
Yeah, so it's there's some unnecessary, maybe structural repetition, and the And then the riff 2. The riff 2 I love.
Yeah, that's a cool riff.
There are 2 variations on it. That's one thing I do like. The first version they play is like the preview of the second, and the second is like the true insanity version. And that has the kind of intense rhythmic compression that I would expect from Arghoslent, right? And here they take a pedal point thrash riff and they overdrive it so far in terms of articulation, everything's getting picked, that you think his fingers are going to fall off. It's like a modern version of what people must have thought when they heard Overkill by Motorhead for the first time, right?
Yeah.
It's how can we take a really basic kind of thrash gesture and exaggerate it to this like hypnotic black metal-y place? And it's really cool the way that they sort of they work it out a little bit. There are a couple variations towards the end that I think are cool. And then when it shuts out, we're just instantly into this racing blast riff. That could be really cool. Problem is, the blast riff doesn't go anywhere. The song basically ends from there. It does, there's like some, maybe like little breakdowny thing, but not, there is, it's not like some cool fake out. It just runs out of ideas. And to put a point on that, let's compare this track to what its parallel from Incorrigible is, which is Archaic Invincibility. Probably, maybe my favorite track on the record. So this is, I'm going to bring it up now. There's a sort of, oh yeah, my notes are a little obscure here. Let's just listen to it and then discuss how it's like what we just heard and why it's better.
Experimental stage from the burning society to the burn, rival killing.
so you heard it, right?
Oh yeah, it's borderline self-plagiarism.
Yeah. So we start off on the trem version of what becomes the last riff. The sort of the trem verse riff. That has that tense wind-up riff quality, but it's also inherently satisfying because it's aggressive and glorious. And then that sort of turns, they do a subtle turnaround on that into the chorus, which again has that sort of triplet flam, sudden slowdown heaviness. Dun, 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 dun. And then sudden stop, drop into just this huge wind-up riff that's the pedal point, the frantic pedal point version of the verse riff. So there's, and it's like the, you know, the thing that we just heard on Himik Shabbat is like the sort of lesser echo of this, right? Where you have the thrashing, you have the high tension thrashing riff, there's a change up that's more melodic, and then we're back into the insane version of the high tension thrashing riff, right? In Himik Shabbat, the insane riff spits out into nowhere. In this one, the insane riff spits out into the chorus again, but with the instantaneous whiplash heaviness that I think they do well on this record. So there's a direction to it. And yeah, there are just point by point, you can hear them making making gestures at their better work.
Yeah, and that's about as well as they can do.
And we are back from the death metal guy doing his best impression of KK Warslot playing Dublin to review Becoming Thunder by Strix Askesis. This is another independent release. You may remember Strix from about a bit over 2 years ago.
Yeah, I want to say that was
the last record.
Yeah, was that a 21 release?
Those Halcyon Days for Terminus, summer 2021. Yes, we reviewed the self-titled. He submitted it to us, sort of out of the blue. It was, and we really liked it. And this is the follow-up. So the first record was one of the first really pure examples of what we would both agree is like outlaw rock. Mm-hmm. But it was, whereas the center line of that style is something like, the last Makwahedal EP or whatever. This had something in common with the sort of frantic punkish energy of Oldowan Gash. But with, on the one hand, a more sort of primitive, foresty, gravelandy barbarism, a kind of like reverberating woody guitar tone, really raw production, sort of clattering drums. And on the other hand, kinds of tonal color and rhythmic intricacy that really sounded like, like good mathy post-hardcore or something. Mm-hmm. There were lots of, there were tracks that successfully were just sort of ecstatic and bright, in a, without becoming poppy, but while still having almost like a bit of, without being poppy, but also without being like, there are Droog songs that are grim happy, mm-hmm. right? There's stuff on this that just sounds like, fuck yeah, I love trail running. But, you're in contact with, the gods, and you are experiencing animal joy as you trail run, but you're still like, nodding to the cute birds in the trees. So there was a kind of authentic exuberance to it that was really refreshing and unusual, and that was done without being weak. And quite a range. And, we both thought the sound could use some refining in various ways. I imagine you probably didn't like the production too much.
No, but I've kind of got notes on that, especially in the context of the new album, but we'll get to that.
Right. So basically, he emails us out of the blue again and says, literally, I can read this for you. He says, here, I got it. Said, pucker up, boys. I've been listening to Just Inquisition for the past 2 years. I can't remember if I suggested he listen to Inquisition, but it sounds like the sort of thing I would have said on the last interview or last review. Mm-hmm. Because what the music could have used was, it was still a bit too smart. It was pulling on really primal stuff, but it could more fully embrace the barbarism. It could have a more full-throated, fleshed out sound, and more of that kind of masculine directness that you get in, say, the good records by Arghoslent, or whatever, right? And it could be more deliberately retarded in the glorious way that Inquisition is. And this record just accesses all of that, and it hits it out of the fucking park. I love it.
Yeah, this is like an out of nowhere contender for like one of the best albums of the year, which I really did not expect at all from this. I mean, the first record was like pretty cool in its own way, but it didn't make a super lasting impression on me. This one absolutely does.
It was more my thing than yours. I listened to it a good amount that summer when we were reviewing it, but I didn't come back to it that much, in part because it was just kind of a deliberately difficult listen, right? Kind of, scratchy and weird. This is awesome, and this is pretty much what I've been hoping for in terms of the movement beyond black metal in America, whether you want to call that outlaw rock or something else. This would be an outlaw rock record, just in a really different sense of the word.
Oh, well, this is super outlaw rock. It's it is very different. So when I first listened to this album, I was like, oh, this sounds like a completely different band. But then I went back and I listened to a couple tracks off of the first one just to kind of spot check my impression. And I realized, getting back to what we originally said about the production, a big shift in production he hasn't just improved the sound quality, he's massively clarified what the band is about. Because, when I went back to the first album after hearing this one, I realized, oh, all of these constituent parts are basically there, albeit, less refined. But I guess the thing when I heard the first one was okay, so clattery drum performance and real thin guitars, and he's shrieky. This is all very lo-fi. I thought there was more of a gesture towards a sort of indie jangle thing going on. But
into mysterious guy hardcore.
Yeah, but I think that was more of an accident of the production than a quality of the music itself, and this clarifies it. Because this is really fucking heavy and cool and dumber, but in a good way. Dumber and as a result smarter.
Yes, this is the epitome of stupid smart.
Yes, this is a very good record.
This is Terminus canon instantly.
Oh yeah, this is he should just go all the fucking way down this route. So you've got your impression of where some of these ideas are coming from. You've got Inquisition, and what else are you thinking? Because I've got a weird take on some of these ideas.
Well, I think Inquisition is all over this. I think. Do you want me to get into the musical qualities, or just name
Well, yeah. Let's just talk about our overall impressions.
Yeah. So I guess the thing that's interesting to me in terms of the take on outlaw rock here, a lot of that music sounds like basically stompy RAC black metal transforming into jangling country rock and roll type stuff, right? And the first Strix pointed a little more in that direction. This record is rockish in a completely different way. It's it is rock being mined for heaviness. And rock music, this has little outer resemblance to rock music. Rock is providing content rather than the form. The music works very differently. But there's tons of things in here that you could isolate as big, greasy, rockish riffs, which you'll get into more. What it's getting some things from Inquisition. So I mean, just a lot of the riffing, core riffing, forms on here are coming from Inquisition, but there are some important things about the composition. Right? One is the mood. Inquisition is fiercely objective. It's almost emotionally blank. It is brutal and epic. Those are the two things it is, and that's basically the only qualifiers you can use for the first few Inquisition records. There's not any cosmic yearning. There's no striving or struggling. There's no narrative or development, right? All there is just instantaneously effective, continuous action. And it's music that is written physically first. It's written to produce. It's written for function. So the Strix has really captured that about Inquisition. And it's also something that links this to grindcore. I would say that like it links that it's a way Inquisition is like grind, and it's a way that Strix in some way is like grind. In that things are written not so much for either standalone riff ideas or interrelated things or interrelated themes that are structured in this top-down way, but that it's written directly to produce the riffs are linked and move from one to the next because with the goal of producing maximum heaviness and impact and physical torque. And in that way, and they're liberated from some constraints of song structure, either in rock and in metal, right? And in that way, I think it's kind of like written like all extreme music when it was at its most experimental. That is like, hey, how do we get to the next riff? Well, what if we just took part of this riff and sort of just locked into it for 8 bars, and then that would shift the momentum and spit us out into the next riff. And it would be really heavy and sound insane. Yeah. And they just would do that because there was no preconceived notion of how a grindcore song or a black metal song or a death metal song would go. These songs are written from the origin in that way. There is no preconceived notion of where the songs have to go. They are just designed to be crushing and triumphant.
Well, the way you talk about that strikes me as like one of the bands that I immediately thought of when I listened to this one. I was kind of surprised you didn't mention in your notes was this is the closest thing I've heard to the Ink and Fire record.
Interesting. Completely different production values, but that's what do you mean?
Oh, the sort of like the really high speed, almost off the cuff way it proceeds, the riffing that has something to do with the blues and something to do with Blazebirth Hall, and but also just has like an almost like psychedelic wrench chucked into it also. Like, this strikes me as, like, maybe not immediately musically, but, like, the effect I get from listening to this is very, very similar to listening to the Ink and Fire record.
Okay, that makes sense. Because the Ink and Fire record, in a lot of ways, is like the sort of jangly, the jangly, absurd-based outlaw rock, but driven to this noisecore extreme, right?
Yeah.
And I think I see what you mean. Yes, I mean, there's a track on the Strix record called Mania, right? Wasn't there a Finn track called Manias? I think there was. It's either Finn or Ink and Fire. But they both have this kind of like rabid manic energy, and I see what you mean about the melodic DNA being very similar, right?
Yeah. I think they end up producing very different effects in their riffs, but they're like listening to a lot of the same bands.
Yes, and they're both kind of what's happening is very punk, but in a way that has nothing to do with actual punk music these days, at least.
Well, metal. I think I've said this on the show before. It's like metal took all the good things from punk.
Yes, I completely agree.
The actual living legacy of punk is wholly contained within metal. Guys, you don't need to listen to like current punk bands. That's not something you need to do. It's like you can.
And the older I get, the less I do.
It's like soldiers. You can all go home. The war's over. It's just that we got everything we needed from punk. So.
Right. The Black and Death Metal negotiated with them and gave them exceedingly good surrender terms.
I was about to say this is kind of like a Japan 45 situation.
So anyway, so there's the Inquisition, grindcore, Ink and Fire. I think yes, like the Blazebirth Hall for this band, both in terms of the free way he structures riffs and songs, the specific shapes of the riffs. There's a lot of Blazebirth Hall at their most experimental, and there's still a lot of Graveland. Graveland being another band that's very interested in gut level. Graveland could be a chug band, and on certain records, like Will Stronger the Death is a chug band. So Graveland interested in sort of muscular rhythmic impact, mid-tempo physical music with some drone to it. Graveland is here too still. And I think there are also shades of Screamo all over this.
Oh yeah, dude. Like this is very Screamo. I mean, I think that was even more apparent on the first record. Where the kind of jangly production.
Record,
you know,
the first record had the glassy and fragile thing with that would link it to Screamo, right? And it had the some specific riffs that were those post-hardcore riffs. This sounds like the Screamo bands that really understand black metal. Did you ever listen to Terzage der Horde? Probably not.
I think I've heard a little bit. I don't really remember it well, though.
Yeah, they're a Dutch band that is spiritually opposed to black metal, but really understands black metal. Mm-hmm. So you could say the music ends up being Screamo, but it's powerfully informed by they really get Hate Forest and BBH.
Yeah,
but it's just lots of rabid, aggressive vocal the vocals in this record sound like Terzage der Horde. Sort of rabid, pukey, Screamo vocals, and the and an interest in using things like octaves to play big, droning Slav black riffs, and just beefy layering of tone. This record has we're sort of buried the lead here in terms of how beefy the tone is on this record.
It's very heavy, which is interesting, and I like that, which is weird because, like I've said on the show before, it's like I don't go to black metal for heaviness. That's like a completely tertiary concern. But here, it focuses on the heaviness in a really cool way that makes me rethink the relationship there.
Cool.
So the last thing I want to say before we start moving towards samples is the very big and very important rock stuff going on here. And we've over the past few years, on the show, we've talked about outlaw rock and we've talked about the relationship between black metal and rock music. And this is another case where this is a black metal, at least adjacent project that has a lot to do with thrash and a lot to do with rock, but I don't think I've ever heard a band like this pull on these specific strings of rock before. Because what I really identify here is mostly heavy rock from the grunge era. I'm hearing a lot of Soundgarden and Helmet and Faith No More, those are cool things. I like that whole era of rock music, but I don't think I've ever heard that approached so directly in a black metal context, and I definitely wouldn't expect it to work as well as it does here. I'm not sure if that was a conscious decision on the part of this guy, but a lot of the things that we're gesturing toward, Ink and Fire, Inquisition, these are all bands that are playing around with pentatonic scales, are deeply connected to these sort of rock motifs. So it could just be something he got to in parallel.
There's a very common perspective on Inquisition, which is incorrect, which is that, or rather, it is correct. People have described it as it's just Pantera with blast beats. Mm-hmm. And my answer to that is simply that's sick. So there's a way you go through Inquisition and just end up at greasy groove metal sludge riffs, and from there, you're pretty close to Helmet, Soundgarden, Faith No More. So it could just be through the black metal influences, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was listening to some sort of heavy, grungy stuff.
Yeah. I'll have a direct comparison later that I'm sure you haven't heard before, and I think it will shock you. But
probably not. Yeah.
Let's listen to something. I just want to hear parts of this album again.
Yeah.
It's really fucking good, dude. This is, for any of you out there who are concerned about the veracity of janglecore black metal from Vermont, no, this is fucking awesome.
Yeah. This is it doesn't jangle anymore. So we are going to start on, I think we can now, you've said this before, it's now possible to really pick out outlaw rock riffs, modern American, whatever is after black metal riffs. We're going to start out on one, and it's going to be fairly familiar. It's almost sort of like a Pan-American Native Front thing. I feel like this guy hangs out so much in big, broad pentatonic territory, melodic territory. We're almost in Hiawatha territory. Sort of like some of it sounds like the Indian themes in westerns. And we're going to start out with something like that. But then listen to the way the lower guitar comes unstuck from the upper guitar. And then the way the riffs spit one another out in rapid fire.
You got a bass guitar this time. That's cool.
Nice. So we rock it out there on a big greasy riff that you could say is either, it could be a grunge riff, but is really directly an Inquisition riff. Mm-hmm. It's one of the sort of the slow, one of the slow sort of goat skull riffs on the Inquisition records. But the action that happens before then is just insane. So I can't even quite hum it, right? There's this sort of elaborate melody.
It's not really, they're not really riffs. It's just two guitar lines going for like 12 or 16 bars without repetition. And
there are some repeated phrases in it, or figures, but like it is a continuous single stream of lead. Mm-hmm. There's also not really a lead or rhythm. There's just two riffs going in parallel.
You see, that actually reminded me a lot, because you were talking about the Screamo thing earlier. That reminds me a lot of something like Union of Uranus. And then, would that be like One-Eyed God Prophecy type stuff?
I think they shared members.
Yeah,
One-Eyed God Prophecy definitely doesn't have anything like independent melodies. It's pretty
okay. Yeah, Union would do stuff like that. That sort of like racing, like everything's falling apart, but with these very distinct melody lines.
Yeah. And so then it kicks off. There's just this abrupt speed up, and the music almost like leaps. Like, you know, I remember in the Ink and Fire record we talked about like Appalachian Spring or something. There's a sort of like a leaping folk or folk classical kind of figure. You hear the exuberance of the first record in a totally new context here. And then it's almost impossible to describe what happens. It dramatically picks up, and then the drums start Graveland galloping. It Gravelands pretty hard, which produces a sort of breakdown-like effect, but really fast galloping. And then once the melody there passes through a certain pentatonic phrase, he decides to stick on it, right? And you get another very sort of Indian war drums sounding riff. When I heard him commit fully to that riff and play it a couple times, I was like, yes, this record is brilliant. And then that spits us out to the Inquisition stuff. But really, it's like there aren't really what you were saying about that first passage. There aren't really riffs at all on this record. There are, but that's not the primary unit of organization. There certainly aren't sections. Like, we're going to have a section of this kind of riff and that kind of riff and this kind of riff and that kind of riff, and they're going to repeat. The riffs are self-transforming. Each riff imminently spits out the next riff. It generates the next riff out of itself.
Yeah, there's a high emphasis on these very organic, kind of chaotic ways to progress the song, which is very cool. And has to be, like, hard as fuck to do as, like, a one-man operation.
Yeah, it would be easier to figure that stuff out jamming, right?
Yes.
But in this case, you've just got to say, I'm going to play these phrases. I'm going to freely play this phrase until I get the variations that I want, and then I'm either going to remember it or try to get something equally good when I record.
Yeah, it's very mentally demanding.
Yes, you can hear riffing happening in real time, basically. And as like combinations of notes that are in one riff will generate the next one. And the same principle works whether we're dealing with the most mercurial parts of the music, like that, just sort of whiplash metamorphosis we just heard, or the most stable and monolithic. So, like, that Inquisition stuff you just heard sprawls into the, this knuckle-dragging chug section at the end of the song, where, again, I heard that and I was like, I love this record. And he gets into the chug with an almost arbitrary combination of just broad, epic sort of octave, lowered a whole step, just big epic intervals configured in this almost like improvised way. And he just fully commits to it and then instantly produces like 4 different variations on the phrase to create this much broader unit, and maybe repeats that once, but I bet it doesn't totally repeat. And then it just spits out more chug riffs. And what he's following is never an idea of, well, we did this kind of riff, now we need that another kind of riff. It's always just, where is the momentum going?
Yeah. There's a real immediacy to everything that happens. I mean, we've talked so many times about, where can black metal go? Bringing a sort of offhanded improvisational quality back into it is important, and this is a great example of that.
Yeah, this is basically the improvisational element, the rhythmic element, the telluric chug and body to it. This is just, I mean, I have tried to write music like this, basically. Not exactly like this at all, right? But like, this is so cool. And it's hearing shit like this that makes doing the show so exciting.
Yeah.
I was going to do an Inquisition sample at the beginning of the review, so we had a reference, but I forgot to do it. Maybe we'll just save that, go on to yours.
Yeah, sure, we can do that. Yeah. So let's go to the second track, Autophagy, which is... this is a really good representative sample, and I think that one of the most powerful features of the record is this guy's, like, he understands how to identify these points of inflection between black metal and heavy rock music in ways that I wouldn't expect. Like, it's very easy to understand the way, like, pagan black metal and sort of RAC stuff intersects, but finding the way to weave yourself from, like, BBH into, like, really heavy, groovy rock in a purely American idiom, that's fucking hard to do. And this guy manages to stick the landing pretty much every time, even in, like, points of massive contrast. So here we're going to have an example of that. So we're going to go like a minute and a half in, and we're going to open with a sort of BBH drone riff, but then it's going to drop directly into this really heavy 90s rock material. And the record as a whole thrives off of these moments. This is a weird case. You said that this This record isn't really riff-based as such, which I agree with. The fundamental unit of most metal is the riff, but here the most fundamental unit on this record is sort of the transition between riffs. Like on your last sample, that crazy acceleration that happens, as he pulls into a really speedy riff. These sort of wild, whiplash-inducing changes are actually some of the most exciting moments. And it's really interesting to hear a record that's organized around that. So let's check this one out. This guy knows how to select for the exact moments on rock radio that matter to you as a metalhead. So, I think that, like, one of the marks of somebody who really fucking gets it and is really good at making extreme metal is, like, knowing when and how to execute one of those, like, just 3-chord gestures that we've heard 1,000 times. When you're able to create the context that restores the power to those, like, just simple power chord phrases that you've heard so many times in the past. Like, when we talk about records like that play death metal records where they play master riffs and they, like, execute on the promise, or Celtic Frost riffs, there's nothing from those bands' catalogs that hasn't been done thousands of times. And at this point, especially guys like us who have been listening to this music for so long, it usually just comes off as, like, a whatever gesture, but once in a while you get a guy who, like, knows how to do it, and he does it here. So like I was saying, so at the beginning you've got that really cool kind of BBH drone riff that drops into something like a screamo type breakdown, but then he lowers the tempo a little bit and plays around a little bit with the rhythm, and then we're just in, like, full early 2000s American metalcore territory. Yeah, that's like an American metalcore band on the 3rd stage at Warped Tour in 2003.
But it's a bit more unhinged. The intervals are, like, grimmer. You know what it sounds like? It sounds like Heaven Shall Burn.
Yeah. Well, I think that back in the early 2000s, you would hear a lot more intervals like that.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's not all Darkest Hour. Right?
Yeah, the totally like slick, polished stuff took a while. Like, I was listening to the other day. I was in the car. I was listening to the first Dead to Fall record. If you remember that band, they were a band, a really early band that was trying to figure out how metalcore plus like Gothenburg work together. So they've got all the pieces of both, but they're executed at very strange tempos. It's this odd liminal record that I have a lot of affection for. And this guy's picked up on some of those ideas, those early gestures toward those things, and the power those things had through their sort of tonic instability, if that makes any sort of sense.
Tonic instability.
Well, there was a quality to that music, those very early sort of American metalcore records, where it hadn't all been sorted out yet. And,
they hadn't like defined their melodic center yet.
Yeah, and the weirdness of it made it heavier in a way. The sort of awkwardness of it.
That's the kind of thing I was thinking about with Heaven Shall Burn, too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, Heaven Shall Burn is like honorary American metalcore.
Yeah. It's, so that makes a... Yeah, that part is awesome. And then it ends up in the kind of metalcore breakdown that's highly... It ends up in this highly melodic stuff over double bass, which sounds like the parts you love on the Winterfilleth records.
Yes. Beautiful, just like winding twin lead stuff with, a very like straightforward but like perpetually powerful sort of folk melody. This guy has like got a really good ear for like restoring the strength of a lot of these simple ideas.
I like that. Yeah. And yeah, so what else? You've also got the next sample, right?
Yeah, which is so fucking cool. And I'm just going to start like air punching in my living room, and I'm just going to like disconnect everything accidentally. That's going to be the end of the show as soon as we play this song. So this is Death Gaze, which is the coolest song on the album and probably the dumbest and heaviest too. We're just going to play a couple minutes of it from the beginning. I'm not going to give any more preamble. We'll talk about it after I've fixed all my equipment. dude, that is so fucking good. When I heard that, I was just like, you can't be getting away with this. You've just got like 5 big, greasy, circa 1994 hard rock riffs. All of them lead into each other in this brilliant fashion. All of them are like convincingly authentic, yet like completely unique to this band. I'm getting like weird flashes of stuff like Silverchair and shit listening to that. And I also want to say the sort of like bellowing half clean vocals into the full cleans, that should just be the primary vocal technique of this band. Like, he does it in just a couple isolated spots on this record, but it's so fucking cool. I think that it should be the primary thing he does vocally.
By bellowing half cleans, do you mean the puke vocals? There's kind of an incremental thing. There's puke vocals at the beginning of the song that are like crust or scream.
I like the midpoint before he gets to the full cleans, like after the puke.
Okay. I disagree. I've got to say I disagree on that, because I think there's one way to take the band from here that would be Death Gaze is it. That is the track to define the band. And if this was a band like, if this was a alt culture Inc. band, what would happen would be that the band would become this song. I feel like it's important to have the wretched screeching in there as a barrier to entry and as a defining feature of just what gets me about this part in particular, about the record in general, is it's like liberating all the cool shit in hard rock from hard rock. I don't want it to be a hard rock record.
No, I get what you mean, but I guess I would argue that like even within the sort of theoretical accessibility of that part, it's still just way too fucking complicated. Because that's like 5 different riffs, and the rhythmic pulse is always shifting around in this pretty progressive way. Like it's accessible in its tone, but I think it's just too challenging for like most people, which is where the extreme metal is still like inherent.
I think it's like, it's 5 different riffs, but it also, like the other thing, is just one continuous melody.
Yeah.
Right? I do want to throw the Inquisition back in here, because I think it can speak to something about how he's making these things that are like riffs and not like riffs. Mm-hmm. But first, you've got a reference point sample you want to play.
Yeah, I do.
For this sample in particular.
Yeah, so I was talking about a few like harder rock bands that I think that a lot of this material approaches, and I was kind of like digging around. I wanted to find something that like made that a little clearer. So I landed on a track from Faith No More's Angel Dust back in, I want to say it was 90 or 92 that record came out. I'm guessing, just wild guess, you're not a big fan of Faith No More.
Yeah, I mean, I've only ever heard the songs that you encounter when you're like 18, and I was like, this is terrible.
No, yeah, the singles always sucked, but Faith No More's catalog actually has...
Funky.
Yeah, no, they actually have a lot of cool stuff. And I just want to play a quick, the opening minute off of Caffeine, which is the second track off of Angel Dust. And I think you'll immediately hear like some substantial resemblance.
All over, a
So you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I can hear some of the shifts. Well, certainly like the sort of chug focus. Some of the shifts in emphasis, especially the way it sort of like rolls, one riff rolls into another at the end. And I guess you're thinking especially about the vocal performance, right? Which shifts between the way the vocal performance escalates.
Yeah, the sort of dynamic vocal performance, even just those like simple bluesy runs that they're putting in there, because you got to remember all the guys in Faith No More are like all metal guys also, especially back in the 80s. That's something that's continuous with all the bands that I've mentioned. You know, Soundgarden, Helmet, all these guys are like have like half a foot in metal most of the time, but they mostly use it as like a structural thing. It's almost the opposite of what Strix does. Strix mines rock for content, and these bands mined metal for structural ideas, which I find really interesting. And I just thought this was like a really interesting reference point. I don't think I've ever had a black metal band remind me of Faith No More before, so that's brand new for me.
Well, okay, so I thought of another band in this sphere that to compare it to, which would be Smashing Pumpkins. I think the most aggressive metallic stuff on Smashing Pumpkins doesn't really sound like death metal, but you can tell he's probably listening to Cyanide shit. Like, and to whatever else was happening in death metal in the early 90s. There's a... when he commits to doing riffing, he really riffs in the way a metal guy does.
Yeah.
And songs like, I mean, one I always go back to is Silverfuck, which has this kind of ecstatic raga quality to it, where these big chunky chords really bounce off each other in the way that they do in Deathgasm. And my reference point for the vocals there would just be like, the cleans sound like Pete Steele, which I thought you would say because you're the typo guy.
I can say I think the problem is that I'm such a typo guy. I've heard those records so many times that it's like locked in as this very unique thing. I definitely get what you mean though in terms of resemblance.
Sort of like warbling, like Danzig with more sort of more drawn out and with more sort of warble in it.
Yeah, and I think that Danzig's
kind of like turn on the inflection.
I think that Danzig as a whole is probably a reference point for some of the material here. You know, kind of Danzig at its least goth and most like hard rock.
I think, sure. I think that's a very good point. We've talked before about I've talked before about how more black metal should sound like Danzig, and so I think that's probably right on the money. So. Speed of, like trying to wrap our heads about the riffing, wrap our heads around the riffing, and going into the final sample, which has a lot more just direct Inquisitionisms. I want to play a quick like minute-long Inquisition sample. If I had to highlight one thing about the band, it would be cellular riffing. And you'll hear that when you listen to this. This is off of Invoking the Majestic Throne of Satan. This is Kill with Hate. Full retard Inquisition. The best. The smartest Inquisition.
Before they got into space and stuff.
Yeah, the space. Oh, God. The last Inquisition record. Oof.
What are you talking about? Black Mass for a Mass Grave?
I thought, in retrospect, I like it less just because it was so spacey.
Oh, I don't know. I still like that one a lot. But anyway, I like the spacey Inquisition.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, they've just never made a bad record. So I'll give you that, right? It's just not my thing. Mm-hmm. But basically, this is the most rigorous, minimal Inquisition. Everything that they would have later is already here, as you could hear in the descending blang, 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 blang. That's sort of crashing open chords. But it's in much more compressed form. We talk sometimes about cellular riffing on the show. What we mean is there's a tiny cell, a little micro unit that gets recontextualized, that gets sort of reiterated in varied ways. So in this case, it's da 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 da, and the main riff is like da 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 da, and then the second time they play it, they change the last note, da 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 da. So it escalates. And basically they do it as a retarded black thrash blast beat, and then they half time it, so it becomes this rolling sinister breakdown. They do it again, and then they drop to just the chug, da 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 da, which is another sort of little cell phrase. And they do that. There's no sense that has to immediately become the next riff, right? They just do that for a while until momentum-wise it makes sense to drop in that descending chord figure. And then they do that, and then after a certain number, after 3 or 4 reps, they do the descending chord figure again and again, and it metamorphoses into the riff. Mm-hmm. So you can hear these little cell phrases generating. Each riff generates the next one, and it's sort of and it's being written for. It's not being written riff section by riff section. It's being written with an eye to the body. And so here we go to the last track on the record, Final Ride of Destruction. The first half of the track is basically just a massive chain of perfectly executed Inquisitionisms. And it's kind of it's the launcher for the second half of the song. It's extremely enjoyable in itself, but as you roll through it, it's setting up the rest of the track. So the sample is going to... we're going to start at the end of the first part and the launch of the second part. And so you should know what the song has done so far. What this track really encapsulates about Strix and what they're drawing from Inquisition is transfer of momentum, right? We talked a bit about that in the Arghoslent review too, about how they did that on their old stuff. So this track, we start off with rolling double bass drone, just the classic Inquisition. Then we get a couple of those, goat skull throwdown riffs. And then it spits us out into a stomp. We're going to start on the stomp. Strix changes up the stomp several times. Listen to the ways he's sort of redirecting the momentum. And so, listen to that stop-start at the end. Right? This sort of racing triplet section just sort of comes clattering to a halt, instantaneously sort of pivots, and then leaps again. And then we're off into more just big, powerful blast riff. The way there's so much shit that happens during that sample, it is difficult to start breaking down. But basically, you can hear again and again this kind of the way that the riffs sort of pivot, redirect, throw their weight in a different direction. There's a dancing and fighting physicality to it. And what else to highlight? I mean, we get into the Inquisition stuff spits us out into a section of triplet blasting, which you're expecting to be in 4/4 when you first hear it. And that transforms for a while. Then we get into this massive chug section that's like something off a Solstice record. And then a wind up into just this absolutely crazy part. How would you describe the sort of the section with all that free melody? It's not a guitar solo.
No, I mean, it's just that seems to be just sort of this guy's methodology is, not working within the confines of the riff. Almost going back to when we were talking about, Into Oblivion, just the idea of these incredibly elongated melodies that aren't conforming to the sort of like structure of extreme metal pacing.
Yeah, Into Oblivion is a really good connection because we're dealing with here is totally new melodic forms. And this is the only way you can start to break. So basically what's happening is he sets up this sort of this storming gallop. It's like triplet blasting, but he's accenting the blasts with the snare so that it sounds like a Graveland kind of the Graveland triplet. It's like the blasts on Following the Voice of Blood, but like faster and more competently executed, and more of a continuum. And so over that, then he's got screamo style octaves playing these transforming figures, and the only way you can really parse it is in terms of cellular riffing, the Inquisition technique, just taken in a much more complex direction, right? There are a couple little 2 to 4 note phrases that he uses that recur in different ways throughout that passage, but totally reconfigured. He leaves space between different runs, which is interesting. It sounds like it's there. It sounds like a lot of writing has gone into it, but it also has the free motion of a solo. One of the only other things I can compare it to is what I like, to me, like maybe the best guitar solo in metal, which is the continuous lead section on Hammer of Damnation by Solstice. But yeah, here it's like a guitar solo. It's like the longest, most unhinged Blazebirth Hall melodies. It's like a permanently screeching battle fanfare. It's glorious.